fawr iawn, thank you Jane. Reit, wel, sesiwn pnawn yma, mae gennym ni siaradwyr amrywiol iawn sy'n dod o wahanol gefndiroedd a da ni'n mynd i gychwyn wrth edrych yn ôl ac wrth gwrs wedyn edrych ymlaen i'r dyfodol. Dwi yn gobeithio fydda ni'n gallu rhoi rhyw fath o ogwydd yr economi gylchol, y circular economy fan hyn. Nid yn unig edrych ar tyfu ffrwythau a chnau fel sydd ar y rhaglen, o bydd ni'n ystyried sut da ni'n gwneud y mwyaf o'r ffrwythau neu'r chnau da ni'n ei tyfu ar gyfer creu busnes ac elw, ond hefyd ar gyfer bioamrywiaeth. A wedyn fydda ni'n edrych ar sut da ni yn gwneud y mwyaf o'r gwastraff sydd yn dod o'r gadwyn i gyflenwi ar hyn o bryd sydd yn un ffordd, lle da ni'n defnyddio adnoddau creu yn wastraffus a felly creu prinder os ydy hyn yn tir neu bridd, a hefyd wrth gwrs oherwydd bod ni gyda systemau bwyd sy'n eitha wastraffus ar hyn o bryd, yn creu gwastraff ar yr pen defnyddio a prynu. Wedyn mae y panel hefyd yn mynd i sôn heddiw yma am sut i gael cylch yna a sut i wneud y mwyaf o'r bwyd sydd gennym ni ar gyfer lles gymunedol. Felly siaradwyr heddiw yma ydy Carwyn Graves, Luke Tyler, ac Vince Mears a Simon Shanks o Ffrwythau Cymru. Mi gan nhw egluro cyflwyno hynna'n well na'r gwaith rydw i'n neud y fan hyn, a bydd gen nhw i gyd rhyw 25 awr 20 munud o sgwrs a wedyn gobeithio gadael amser ar gyfer cwestiynau. So chi roed eich cwestiynau yn y chat os hoffwch, neu ar y diwedd os ydych chi yn gallu dadfiwtio'ch hynna'n, gallwch chi wrth gwrs gofyn y cwestiynau, ond os chi'n gadael fi wybod wrth roed eich llaw i fyny os ydy hynna'n bosib. Felly ymlaen, i gyflwyno Carwyn fel hanesydd bwyd, ond mae Carwyn hefyd yn fwy na hanesydd bwyd. Dwi'n meddwl bod yn arloeswr yn y maes bwyd. Felly dosodd i chi, Carwyn.
Diolch yn fawr, Eifiona, mae'n dda iawn cael bod yma gyda chi. Diolch i bob un am y gwaith da i chi gyd yn gwneud yn eich meysydd eich hun. Mae'n ysbrydoliaeth. Dwi'n mynd i fynd ar garlam, dwi'n mynd i orffen o fewn 16 munud, so he says, a dwi'n mynd i siarad am ffrwyth a chnau yng Nghymru wrth edrych yn ôl i'n gorffennol ni ac i'n treftadaeth ni. Peth cychwynnol i ddweud yma yw nad dechrau stori ydyn ni, nid dechrau y stori yw hi nawr o ran tyfu tyfu ffrwythau a chnau ar goed yng Nghymru a defnyddio nhw. Yn aml byddech chi'n gallu edrych ar lyfrau hanes amaeth yng Nghymru a meddwl taw dim ond nawr mae dechrau, ond nid fel yma hi. Mae yna hanes hir eithriadol o hyn. Dwi ddim am gyflwyno, o ran dweud wrth chi pwy ydw i, dwi'n mynd i rannu'n sgrin. Dwi ddim am gyflwyno i chi y stori dwi wedi sgrifennu gyda help team o'r Adfotaneg. Mae yna stori chi'n gallu cael yn y llyfr, ddoth allan 2018 afalau Cymru. Ac mae hwnna nid yn unig yn sôn am afalau, ond ffrwythau eraill hefyd. Dwi ddim yn mynd ar ôl hynny heddi, ond dwi wedi rhoi'r teitl yma i be dwi'n mynd i rannu gyda chi. Clesinen a chollen, ffrwythau a chnau yng Nghymru yn hanesyddol felly. Codi cwr y llen yn unig byddwn ni'n gallu gwneud yn yr amser, ac felly ymlaen â ni. Y peth cyntaf i ddweud yw bod angen meddwl am ffrwythau a chnau yng Nghymru yn hanesyddol ar ffurf spectra. Mae yna sawl spectrwm sy'n berthnasol i ddechrau deall y darlun yn hanesyddol felly. Y spectrwm cyntaf yw y spectrwm hwnnw sy'n rhedeg o blasau'r bonedd ar y naill llawt, y tai mawrion hynny, a'i gerddi nhw, a wedyn gerddi tyddynwyr ar y llaw arall. Pobl oedd yn aml yn talu rent ac yn gerddi bychen hunan gynhaliol. Yr ail spectrwm yw'r spectrwm sy'n rhedeg rhwng cynnyrch gardd a chynhiaf gwyllt. A mi welwn ni yng Nghymru bod y spectrwm yna ddim mor glir ag yw mewn llefydd eraill. Hynny yw bod yna llawer o glystyru yn y canol. Mae yna diffyg tystiolaeth, ond da ni'n ôl at hynny. Trydydd spectrwm, bach yn chwerthinllydd efallai, ond mae'n rhedeg rhwng afalau a bob un ffrwyth arall. Mae afalau mor bwysig, nid yn unig o ran yr hyn byddwn ni'n galw'n afal heddi, ond y syniad o beth yw ffrwyth yn hanesyddol o fewn diwylliant y Cymru. Felly mae'r spectrwm yn rhedeg rhwng afalau a ffrwythau eraill. Mae pedwerydd spectrwm yw rhwng chnau, cyll, chi'n gweld yn y Saesneg wedi rhoi hazelnuts. Hynny yw, gair pwysig o eglurhad yma. Mae'r gair Cymraeg chnau yn ei hanfod yn golygu'r hyn fydden ni'n alw yn Saesneg yn hazelnuts. Bod ni'n defnyddio fe heddi i olygu'r hyn mae'r Saeson yn galw yn nuts. Felly rhwng chnau, y gollen, a phob chneuen arall, spectrwm. Eto, y gollen yn holl bwysig. Symudwn ni mlaen, dyna'r spectrwm mae sy'n berthnasol. Dwi eisiau chi dal rheina mewn golwg wrth i ni edrych ar bethau. Ond dwi'n mynd i roi lle blaenllaw i dystiolaeth uniongyrchol pobl trwy hanes a amrywiaeth o leisiau. Dyma un da i ddechrau. Mr Gerall Gymro. Fi'n gobeithio chi'n hoffi'r llun ges i ohono fe. Tua 1280, dyma fe'n sgrifennu yn Lladin o fe'n sgrifennu. Almost all the population lives on its flocks and on oats, milk, cheese and butter. Sôn am y Cymru, Mae'r. Mae'n rhoi fath o darlun un ochrog yma, a syml iawn, a mae'n mynd mlaen i ddweud bod nhw ddim yn arfer gerddi, bod nhw ddim yn tyfu pethau mewn gerddi na perllanau chwaith. Ond mewn mannau eraill yn ei waith, mae wedyn yn disgrifio perllanau mewn sawl man gwahanol ar draws Cymru. Ac felly mae'r disgrifiad mae'n rhoi ar un llaw ddim yn gydnaws ar hyn mae'n mynd mlaen i ddweud yn nes ymlaen yn yr un darn. Mae'n cymryd y pethau hyn gyda pinsiad o halen a dechrau twrio yn ddyfnach. Felly mae canfyddiadau yn bwysig. Cyn i ni ddod nôl at ganfyddiadau, beth am ystadegau? Dau beth o wahanol, o adeg llawer diweddarach cyn y cyfnod modern. Un yw cyhoeddiad 1877, y Llywodraeth San Steffan ar ddefnydd tir. Ac mae'r adroddiad yna yn nodi bod 2619 o erwau o berllan yng Nghymru yn y flwyddyn honno. A hynny'n sylweddol mwy nag oedd yn yr Alban yr un pryd. Rhywbeth arall i roi mewn i'r darlun. Roedd yma feithrinfa yn perthyn i ddyn nhw'n Hines yn Nyffryn Teifi yn 1814, cyn y rheilffyrdd, cyn oes y diwydiannau mawr, yng nghanol Dyffryn Teifi, ac roedd meithrinfa Hines yn y cyfnod yma yn cadw cofnod o'r hyn oedd yn gwerthu mewn blwyddyn, ac yn y flwyddyn dan sylw, mae oedden nhw wedi gwerthu 3,000 coed castan yn lleol, a wedyn hefyd 3,000 o afallenau. A mae'n nodi of the choicest sorts. Mae hynny'n dweud wrth ni a rhywbeth am y mathau o afal oedd yn cael ei gwerthu yma. Felly, wrth i ni edrych ar y cyfnod diweddar yma, ni'n gweld ystadegau sydd yn dechrau rhoi darlun i ni o goed ac o ffrwythau a hefyd chnau, sweet chestnut, chnau, yn cael ei gwerthu ac yn cael ei tyfu yn eang yng Nghymru. Iawn, beth am i ni ddechrau mynd yn ôl mewn hanes eto? Dyna'r ystadegau. Beth am disgrifiadau o'r cyfnod a'r cyfnodion? 1795, plas newydd yn Llangollen, lle oedd y ddwy chwaer enwog yn byw. Mae cyfnodion preifat y tŷ yn cynnwys disgrifiadau o'r ardd yn y flwyddyn yma a sawl blwyddyn gwahanol, ac disgrifiadau ymwelwyr i'r ardd. Ac ymwelwyr yn 1795 yn dweud, the fruit trees are of the rarest and finest sort and luxuriant in their produce. Beth yw y fruit trees hyn? Wel, mae'r rhestr yn mynd mlaen, y disgrifiad yn cynnwys melwm, ffigys, eirin gwlanog, bricyll, ceirios, eirin Mae'r, mafon, mefus, gwynwydd ac yn wir mwy na hynny. Amrywiaeth sylweddol o goed ffrwythau o statws uchel yn y tŷ yma oedd yn perthyn i ddwy chwaer gyfoethog yn y bryniau yna yn Llangollen. Iawn. Thomas Dainley, 1684, ni'n mynd nôl dros ganrif eto. Teithiwr ar draws Cymru yn y cyfnod yma ar ôl y rhyfeloedd cartref, ac mae e'n disgrifio arferion y Cymru tlawd nawr. Ni'n mynd i ochr arall un o'r spectrymau yma. Dyma beth sydd gyda fe i ddweud am y bobl yn ardal Aberteifi. They have choice wine. Okay, what sort of wine? They have choice wine also of their own growth off the mountains, which the Welsh gentlewomen make of raspberries, and which abound in these parts. Sawl peth allan ni ddweud fyna, yn un peth, mountains don't mean mountains. Mae mynydd yn golygu tir comin yn y cyd-destun yma ac yn yr oes yma. Ewn ni ddim ar ôl hynny, ond dwi eisiau just tynnu'r sylw at y ffaith bod y bobl yn Aberteifi, y Welsh gentlewomen, yn gwneud gwin cartref o Fafon yn 1684. Neudwn ni just tipyn bach ymlaen eto i Heath Malkin, teithiwr arall oedd wedi dod o Lundain yn achos e. 1854, teithio Cymru, ac yn arsylwi ar yr arferion ethnograffeg diddorol roedd y brodorion yn defnyddio. 1854 yn Morgannwg. They use vegetables of all kinds in large quantities and many kinds of food prepared from apples, gooseberries and other fruit. Iawn. Diddorol. Apples, gooseberries and other fruits. Many kinds of food yn cael eu paratoi o'r ffrwythau hyn. Afalau, wrth gwrs, yn dod yn gyntaf yn y rhestr. Lle oedd yr afalau hyn yn cael eu tyfu? Eto, edrych ydyn ni ar disgrifiadau yma. Dyma ddisgrifiad arall. Mae'r data yma wedi tynnu o map begwm, o ogledd Cymru o ardal Penrhyn, Llandudno. A mae gyda ni enwau ceiau yma mewn un colofn. Yn y golofn arall, mae gyda ni disgrifiad o'r cyfnod, o'r defnydd oedd yn cael ei gwneud o'r ceiau oedd yn dwy'n yr enwau hyn. Ac chi'n gweld cae 592 yn cael ei alw yn orchard, a pa fath o ddefnydd tir yw e? Wel, pasture. Mae yna rhywbeth yna am agroforestry yn does e, ac agrogoedwigaeth Gymraeg a Chymreig yn hanesyddol. Wedyn, be dwi eisiau rhoi i chi, ac os ydych chi'n anghytuno, ewch i ddarllen y llyfr, yw mae'r afal oedd yn dominyddu. Dwi'n mynd i ddangos hyn mewn un ffordd arall rili wir. Yr afal oedd yn dominyddu. Cyfraith Hywel yn dangos hynny, cofnodion y mynachlogydd yn dangos hynny, y draddodiad Seidr yn dangos hynny, y seitiau yn dominyddu, a nifer o fathau cynhenid. A hynny yn rhan wedyn o systemau amaeth a systemau coginio a bwyd ehangach, fel yn ni newydd weld o'r disgrifiadau hyn. Ond wrth ni dwrio ymhellach wedyn i faes ffrwyth yn benodol, dwi eisiau agor yr ffwyd ac dod at bethau nawr o safbwynt ieithyddol. Mae tystiolaeth enwau yn arwyddocaol a mae wedi cael ei anwybyddu i raddau. Mae bydolaeth enwau Cymraeg ar ffrwythau ac ar chnau yn ddoi hun yn adrodd straeon. Mae'r ffaith bod yna enwau Cymraeg sydd ddim yn fenthygiadau o'r Saesneg, neu'n hen fenthygiadau o'r Saesneg, yn ddoi hun yn awgrymu bod y ffrwythau hyn yn bresennol cyn oes Victoria, ond yn aml hyd yn oed cyn oes Elizabeth pan dechreuwyd am y tro cyntaf ffurfio geiriaduron a dechrau benthyg geiriau ar raddfa hirach. Dau enghraifft o hynny, gair da Cymraeg ffigys. Y gair ffigys yn ymddangos yn gyntaf yng ngwaith y beirdd yn yr oesoedd canol o gwmpas y flwyddyn 1400. Yn yr un modd, eirin pêr i olygu prwn eto yn ymddangos yng ngwaith y beirdd iolo goch yn yr achos yma o gwmpas y flwyddyn 1400. Bob rheswm i feddwl, yng Nghymru fel yn rhyddau eraill o Ewrop yn y cyfnod, yr oedd o leia top y gymdeithas yn gyfarwydd a bwyta ffigys a eirin pêr, bricyll a sawl peth arall. Un bach diddorol dwi wedi rhoi ar y sleid yma yw clesinen, gair sydd wedi marw allan i bob pwrpas, ond yn golygu yr hyn fyddai'n cael ei alw hefyd ar lafar gwlad yn afal cwins. Ond gwreiddyn y gair clesinen yw y gair clas. A bydd rhai ohonoch chi falle'n gwybod bod clas yn golygu lle mynachlogaidd, cloister. A'r gair hwn yn ddiddorol iawn wedi dod i fyny yn Sir Fynwy yn ôl tystiolaeth dogfennol. A byddwn ni ddim yn syni at hynny yn yr oesoedd canol, bydde hinsawdd Sir Fynwy yn llawer mwy addas i dyfu quinces nag unrhyw rhan arall o Gymru. Felly mae yna straeon lleol yma sydd yn troi gwead llawer mwy diddorol i'r darlun cenedlaethol. Un bach arall, i ddod as peth o ochr arall, un o'r spectrymau, soniais i amdano nhw, yw mwyar. Mae mwyar yn tyfu'n wyllt wrth gwrs ar draws y wlad ac wedi gwneud yn ôl tystiolaeth archeoleg ers rhai miloedd o flynyddoedd. Gwreiddyn y gair. Mwyar yw'r gair yma smywar. Gair sydd wedi cael ei ail-lunio gan ieithyddion, dyna pan mae'n seren fach. Mi oedd y gair smywar yn yr hen Gelteg yn golygu ffrwyth. Mae hwnna'n rhoi syniad i ni o bwysigrwydd mwyar a'r fwyaren. Peth arall yw ffrenig. Mae llawer o'r enwau Cymreig ar ffrwyth ac ar gnau yn dwyn rhan o'r enw yw ffrenig. Mwyar ffrenig, yn enghraifft, i olygu'r hyn byddwn ni'n gael yn Saesneg yn mulberry, a chnau ffrenig, yr hyn byddwn ni'n gael yn Saesneg yn walnut. Hynny yw, dyma'r Cymru yn cydnabod bod y ffrwythau a'r chnau hyn yn dod ar draws gyda'r Normaniaid, yna pan maen nhw'n ffrenig, ond maen nhw'n rhoi ei enw eu hunain. Mae'r rhain yn newydd ddyfodiaid 800 mlynedd yn ôl, sydd yn bresennol yng Nghymru, ond yn estron, dyna pan maen nhw'n cael enw sydd yn cynnwys enw cenedl arall mwyar ffrenig. A wedyn yn ôl i'r afalau, gair o'r rhestr bach i chi, jyst i danlinellu eto pwysigrwydd yr afalau ar draws Cymru, ar draws y cyfnodau hanesyddol. Afal cariad. Beth yw afal cariad? Tomato. Afal quince, wedi sôn yn barod, y quince. Afal eiraid, gair cyffredin iawn, rhai canrifoedd yn ôl i olygu oren. Afal garnad yw pomegranate. Afal pîn, gallwn ni fynd ymlaen ac ymlaen. Mi oedd ffrwythau newydd yn aml yn cael ei galw yn afal rhywbeth. Afal deiar yna i'r Cymraeg am y daten. A tu hwnt i hynny, beth olaf i ddweud am ffrwyth, yw bod Walter Davies yn ei arolwg o amaethyddiaeth yng Nghymru yn 1814 yn sôn yn y cyfnod yna am win yn cael ei wneud o ffrwyth y griafolen, felly eto ffrwythau gwyllt, ffrwyth yr ysgawen a sigyfedwen yn ei oes e. Chi'n gweld gobeithio eto perthnasedd y spectrymau hyn o'n i'n arnynellu ar y dechrau. I gloi, cadw llygad ar y cloc, cnau, cnea, arferiad sy'n mynd nôl i'r oesoedd canol. Mae yna gyfeiriadau yn barddoniaeth oesoedd canol at cnea, ond ai arfer oedd yn perthyn i blant yn bennaf. Eto tystiolaeth ieithyddol, cnau gardd. Yr amadrodd yma yn Gymraeg, beth ydy'n golygu? Wel, yn ddiddorol iawn, mae gyda ni ddisgrifiad Saesneg o, dwi'n cofio'n iawn, geiriadur Salisbury. Cnau gardd yw filbert, nut neu chestnut. Mae hwnna yn rhoi awgrym o'r mathau o gnau oedd ar achlysur o leia yn cael ei tyfu mewn gerddi. Satain, gair arall sydd wedi marw allan, ond yn golygu sweet chestnut, gair oedd yn cael ei ddefnyddio gan Edward Llwyd ac eraill. Erbyn hyn, castan, dwi'n meddwl, fydden ni'n dweud yn Gymraeg, ond mi oedd satain yn golygu yn benodol iawn, a'r gair maron hefyd, yn golygu yn benodol iawn, cnau neu cneuen, beth fydden ni'n galw yn Saesneg yn sweet chestnut. Y ddau wedi dod o'r Ffrangeg, ac y ddau yn awgrymu mwy o ddefnydd ar y gneuon yma, rhai canrifoedd yn ôl, a ddigwyddodd erbyn oes Victoria. Yr un peth bach olaf yw mes. Mes i wneud coffi a bara. Mae Iolo Morgannwg yn sôn am hyn. Os ydych chi'n gwybod am Iolo Morgannwg, na ydych chi dyfalu pa mor ddibynadwy oedd ei dystiolaethau a'i peidio. I orffen felly ac i gloi, 4 casgliad dwi'n meddwl allan ni dynnu o'r wybdaeth hon. Y gyntaf yw bod ffrwythau a chnau yn ymylol o ran hanes amaethyddol a bwyd yng Nghymru, ond eto'n holl bresennol. Chi wedi gweld y spectrymau dwi wedi disgrifio a'r dystiolaeth dwi wedi rhoi ger bron, jyst yn gyflym iawn, a mae yna llawer mwy y gellid edrych arno fe. Yn ail, ond rhan bwysig o hynny, wrth gwrs, maen nhw'n holl bresennol. Hynny yw, mi oedd rhannau helaeth o'r wlad yn addas yn hanesyddol i dyfu ffrwythau a chnau yng Nghymru, o wahanol mathau. Mathau iawn yn y llefydd iawn, ond mae hyn yn hen beth yng Nghymru, ac nid yn beth newydd. Yr ail gasgliad yw bod ffrwythau ac i raddau llai, chnau, yn rhan gyfarwydd a phwysig yn y tymor iawn, o ddiet trwch y boblogaeth, ac eto ni wedi edrych ar top, bod yr heinau uchaf mwy ac cyfoethog reit drwodd i'r tyfynwyr a bwydydd gwyllt a hyd yn oed arferion plant. Yn drydydd, amrywiaeth eto. Dwi'n gobeithio bod wedi bod yn amlwg o'r hyn dwi wedi dweud, bod amrywiaeth yma o ran y mathau o ffrwythau oedd yn cael eu defnyddio, hyd yn oed os oedden nhw'n cael eu ystyried fel afalau llawer yr amser. Ac yn bedwerydd, un peth dwi wir yn gobeithio sydd yn glir iawn o'r hyn dwi wedi dweud yw bod yna ddiwylliant bwyd yn hanesyddol ynghlwm a ffrwythau a chnau yng Nghymru. Bod yna enwau cynhenid yn yr iaith Gymraeg, bod yna winoedd yn cael ei gwneud o llawer o'r ffrwythau hyn, yn ôl tystiolaeth hanesyddol, bod yna reseitiau yn perthyn i'r diwylliant yma, ac yn y blaen. Pob peth sydd yn rhan o ddiwylliant bwyd. Mae ffrwyth yn rhan o ddiwylliant bwyd hanesyddol Cymru a chnau hefyd. Diwylliant bwyd Cymru, syniad pwysig i'w atgyfodi. Ac mi allwch chi ddarllen mwy ar hyn a llawer mwy ar y we, dwi wedi bod bach yn dawel yna, ond mae llyfr o'r diwedd yn dod allan yn y Gwanwyn, ac croeso chi gysylltu gyda fi. A'r trydar, a mae dau fy mhen yno.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Carwyn, am hynna, diddorol dros ben. Dwi'n cofio hela cnau, da ni'n ei ddweud, a dyna dwi oedden ni'n neud pan yn y blant. Hela cnau cyll yn bennaf, ond hefyd yr sweet chestnuts, dwi'n cofio fi oedd y gair oeddech chi'n defnyddio, ond oedden ni yn chwilio am rheini hefyd pan oedden ni'n blant yn haid yn arbennig felly. Ac yn gwneud ffyn wrth gwrs hefyd o goed cyll. Reit, felly, dwi'n gwybod os oes yna gwestiwn yna uniongyrchol, oes, mae yna un gwestiwn gen Jane Ricketts-Hain yn yr chat. Dwi'n gwybod os ydy bobl isio gofyn i cwestiynau hynna'n? Jane, os ydych chi medru dadfiwtio a gofyn y cwestiwn?
Iawn te, wel, pa hen air am ffrwyth neu cnau, hoffi ti weld dod nôl? Oedd cymaint ohonyn nhw, diolch yn fawr, am gwers ardderchog i ddysgwyr fel ni.
Dwi'n meddwl bod Mae'r mor hyfryd. Mae gooseberries yn iawn, ond mae mae'r enw Mae'r, ewch edrych yn y geiriadur o le mae'r gair yn dod. Mae'n ei gyda'r calendar blynyddol, Mae'r, enw hyfryd.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Mae yna gwestiwn gen ar wiwerod hefyd o squirrels. Dwi'n gobeithio, allan ni jyst cadw hwnnw tan da ni wedi clywed yr cyflwyniad nesaf. Falle gawn ni sgwrs, Barbara, if you're okay, we can save your question and squirrel it for 20 minutes until we hear the talk by Luke Tyler, who's our next speaker, because he'll be talking specifically about squirrels and other wildlife in his talk. So we'll come back to that. Please remind me if we miss it. So, awn ni mlaen rwan i Luke Tyler. Os di Luke yna, fod o'n barod i dadfiwtio ac i gychwyn i sgwrs. Luke yn siarad, dwi'n meddwl yn Saesneg, ond efalla wneith o droi rywun i Gymraeg, dwi'n siŵr iawn sydd mewn di wneud o. A fydd Luke yn sôn, a'n symud ni oddi wrth edrych ar treftadaeth a traddodiadau y tirlun bwyd Cymru i edrych ar y tirlun bwyd ac integreiddio y treftadaeth y cnau gyda bioamrywiaeth ac ar gyfer ddarparu cyfleon i anifeiliaid o wahanol fathau gan gynnwys pobl i fedru defnyddio coed a coed cyll a coed o wahanol fathau ar gyfer cael bwyd. Felly, drosodd i chi, Luke, over to you, Luke.
Diolch i Fiona. Dwi'n siarad yn Saesneg heddiw. Dwi'n dysgu Cymraeg. Dwi ddim yn... I'm not going to be presenting conferences in Cymraeg just yet, but thank you for bearing with me. So just give me a moment. I'm just going to share screen. Here we go. So I'm going to be talking about a few things today. It's essentially the background to what I'm going to talk about is part of how fruit and nut trees are how they fit into the sort of the forestry sector or the land management sector in Wales. A little bit of the background behind that. I'm going to be talking about one of the projects that we've been running, or a small organisation that I help run. And I'm also going to be talking about how some of the challenges that I think surround this dialogue, and also some of the ways in which we can look at funding things in the future, and how this can all fit together. So first of all, just to explain who I am, I wear two hats. I work for Mae'r. I work at the local food team, so my particular remit is concerned mainly with agri-tech. So we're looking at local food supply chains here, growing out of season produce, soft fruits, using hydroponics locally. So we have several projects where we're doing this in schools. We're doing this with local colleges, and we're building an innovation hub at Mae'r Science Park, where we will be looking at different technologies specifically to grow soft fruits and microgreens and other produce that could be out of season, but we create shorter supply chains and support growers who are looking to do this themselves, and specifically try out new technologies like using wool substrates and using seeing how much of this work can be done using Welsh technology and methods. So I'm also, excuse me, I seem to have a slide that's gone missing here. There we go. I'm also chairman of Mae'r. We're a small forestry organisation based on Anglesey, and our remit is to manage the northern part of Newborough Forest for biodiversity and community well-being. In this remit, we've got a lot of emphasis on training, red squirrel conservation. We're a place where red squirrel numbers have been increasing, and a lot of our work is done to provide for that. And also we have a series of training programs that go on. So I'm very much involved in this kind of in funding, subsidising, and the day-to-day activities of this work. So I'll be talking about how that affects how this all comes in here. So to provide a bit of background in the fruit sector, a lot of this was talked about really well in the previous talk by Gadwyn, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. But I'm going to look a little bit at what's changed in terms of the background for fruit and nut production in the UK. And again, part of the emphasis here is looking at why so much produce is grown abroad, and why so much of it is imported when it can quite clearly be produced locally. So I think most people are coming to sort of understand, especially with the Brexit affecting the supply of labourers and the supply chain itself, and also with COVID, it's not really sustainable in the long term to continue importing so many things that we can grow locally from completely different parts of the world. But the problem is that we also have a problem with the diet, in that people in the UK don't eat enough fresh fruit and veg, and what is eaten, only 15% of it at the moment, as of 2016, is grown in the UK. So the first one I want to talk about briefly is hazelnuts. Again, Gadwyn talked about that as well. So we plant quite a lot of hazelnuts in the work we do, but there is a niche market with hazelnuts, which is the cob nuts, which is slightly separate. With hazelnuts, what you often see in shops when you purchase them is kiln-dried, imported nuts. They often come from Italy, but cob nuts are slightly different. It's a seasonal produce. It's fresh. They are particularly rich in vitamin E and calcium. It's It's something that we used to grow a great deal of in the UK. There was the Kent Triangle down in southeast England, where there used to be 100 years ago 7,000 acres purely devoted for carbon production, and that's hugely shrunk over the course of 100 years. The industry has disappeared. But what is interesting is that we're seeing a renewed interest in this kind of crop, or the kind of the idea of growing and promoting more sort of locally grown crops, as we've been seeing with other areas in horticulture. Maybe there's a marketing element here that we can look at for improving the amount of nuts that people consume as well, especially local ones. So we're very keen on planting hazels for a variety of reasons. Here's one of our planting days at Mae'r Science Park. We're keen possibly as well for the as well as nuts. We're also very interested in the biodiversity aspect of it. It's one of the favourite food sources of red squirrels. Much of our work is red squirrel conservation, and we need to provide food sources for them. We also need to have local provenance, and there's again a slight disconnect there in that we need to plant trees that will survive, and if you want trees that are optimized for nut production, you have to have specific cultivars for that. So moving quickly on to orchards, again, I'm not going to talk about this at all in much depth because that was covered extensively in the last talk. But we've got some real advantages economically and environmentally with orchards, and there's been a real interest recently in Wales of trying to increase that. We've got as of last year, I think it was the Horticulture Wales managed to establish the Heritage Orchard Cluster, and we have some really good innovation going on in Wales with regards to orchards and new pear varieties. Some of the real benefits here are that they provide really good habitats for wildlife. They occupy the same part of land for long periods of time. You don't need to apply chemicals. Again, that has positive effects on the water management. It's a means of sequestering carbon. It could be integrated with agroforestry. So it's got a lot of advantages, but the level of the land that's covered with orchards is much lower than it ought to be, and there are some reasons for that I'll talk about in a moment. So just to mention one of our one former colleague of ours, this is just local to us in Bangor. Looking at producing orchard or heritage tree varieties for the orchards that are optimized for the Welsh landscape and cope with the conditions, which has been enormously successful. They're currently sold out on their online shop, and there's very much a connection between the locality and the brand and the story around that and what they're able to grow. So they've done really good things. They've developed new varieties as a means of continuing this industry, but I think there's if this is encouraged, I think there'll be more of this in other sort of areas and other parts of Wales as well. One of our projects that I alluded to earlier that I'll quickly talk about is our forage forest. This is at Llyn Park Mae'r. This is a project that we worked on, and we were converting an area that was primarily it was part of a Corsican pine forest that was heavily diseased with Dophthostroma. And in the last 3 years, what we've done is we've removed the windblow, and we've planted a number of different varieties of fruit trees and berries. And this has been part of our learning and education program. And so that's now free for anyone to visit if they're in Llyn Park Mae'r. We've just finished and opened it, and it's we've sort of got some continual maintenance, and it's part of our education program. The goal that we were particularly looking to achieve here was skill sets that were feeding into rural enterprise, and the feedback we got was really good. Again, this is a smaller part of a much bigger program that we were running, and we're also looking at things like birch sap collecting. That's an EIP, European EIP project, and again other sort of non-timber forest products that we can get. Moving on to the challenges, it all seems like, yeah, we should all be doing this. This is something that we would really like to see more of, but there's some really quite big reasons as to why this isn't happening as much as we'd like at the moment. Part of our observations have been taken from a report that I'm going to talk about in a moment, that we did some research into the sort of supply chain behind this. as mentioned on. And one of the things that really came out is challenges with funding. Funding in the rural sector is not really geared up to support horticulture. It's not really. It can be the amount allocated is much lower than with other forms of rural activity. There's certainly a lack of exemplar projects whereby people can see how things can be done, and a lack of that has meant that it's difficult to sort of inspire people to sort of try new things. A bit of a personal opinion here. I feel that whenever this comes up, people will often say, you can't get farmers to do this because it's a career change. And I always found that's a bit unhelpful, because it's not the business of anybody to try and tell people to change their career. But if we keep saying it's a career change, then it becomes thought of as a career change. And what we are finding is, with particularly the younger generation of farmers that we work with quite a bit, a lot of them are really interested in diversification. And they don't see that as a career change. They see that as farm diversification. We've had farmers that have come to us that want to plant 1,000 hectares of rose bushes for the flower industry. We had farmers that see that very much as part of what they're doing. It's making their business more resilient to change. So part of how I think the whole discourse should be framed is working with people who want to diversify, who want to have support in doing this, and actually facilitate that support, rather than saying we're looking at career change. So I think even in the tone of the language, we need to be quite careful. So that's perhaps an opinion more than anything else, but I thought I'd include it. Climate change. This is a big problem for a few reasons. We need to ensure that trees we plant now are going to be viable 50 years in the future. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. And of course, pests and diseases as well. With recent globalization, the last 20 years, the number of diseases entering the UK that affect trees has increased exponentially. Just this last couple of months, we've had a new species of Phytophthora that's arrived in Cornwall, and last week it was detected in Cumbria. So Phytophtheras are a very virulent strain of water molds or umicites that will attack and kill trees. And because of our sort of hyper-globalized society, even with stringent plant passports and control, it's very difficult to stop biological material moving around. And there are a number of really dangerous pathogens that forest research are very keen will not arrive in the UK. And if they do, it will be catastrophic. So that's an additional challenge that we need to be aware of. At the moment, there's not really a good, I think that the means of controlling pests and diseases are very much just monitoring them and damage control. I think there's real scope to innovate more sort of means of detection and prevention before they actually destroy crops. And it's probably the subject for a separate talk, but it very much affects this whole discourse. These are some of the findings from our research that we did for tree nursery supply chains. We were looking at supplying trees or starting a tree nursery network, and what the problems were from people that we surveyed who wanted to plant trees, and the barriers for them doing that. And this is some of their feedback that I thought was quite interesting. I've talked a bit about the perceived conflict with traditional hill farming, and again, how I don't think that should be phrased as a conflict. There are farmers that really want to diversify, and there aren't really options available for supporting. If anybody's tried to plant to apply for tree nursery or for tree planting, they'll find that glass tier, for instance, you need to have a certain acreage. That's prohibitive for some people. The species mix that you can plant is often quite restricted, and whenever a new form of grant is announced, so most recently it was Twig, or the Woodland Investment Scheme, the Woodland Investment Grant by the Welsh Government as part of the National Forest. It was very much geared at projects that were already had all the permissions in place. The money all had to be spent within 6 months, and that was hugely prohibitive for some of these other projects. And what we need really is longer commitment to investing in. You can't create a forest in a day. And we need to, I think that needs to be reflected in the grant systems. At the moment, grants are very much, money must be spent by a certain time, and it's all very much, it's quite, it doesn't really give the capacity for a lot of people who would do very good work if they were supported properly. There was perceived inaccuracies in the woodland creation opportunities map. Again, that feeds back into the hill farming conflict. And again, this call for sort of simplification, revision, and restructuring of how grants are exist, and maybe a specific horticulture grant or a specific orchards grant that will make this easier. To talk about the sort of strategic planting, we're looking at trees that are probably going to be wind firm, and again, pest and disease. I've talked a bit about that. This can be something that we can look at selective breeding, and continuing to sort of look at this ecosystem service concept. Again, as I mentioned, orchards in particular are very good at providing habitats for wildlife. And again, diversifying existing forests with sort of fruit trees and nut trees. Again, that's something that feeds into planting for biodiversity and as well for carbon. This was some of the feedback, some of the findings of our research in the area that I thought would be was quite interesting here. We asked our respondents, who were sort of forest organisations, landowners, farmers, NGOs in North Wales who were looking to plant trees, to rank the reasons that they were interested in, what the reasons would be for them planting. And what we're seeing is a huge shift away from timber production. It's increasingly a lower priority for people who want to plant trees. And we're seeing some of these other categories like biodiversity and carbon capture become a much higher, much more important purpose for tree planting, as well as these non-wood forest products, and by which I include sort of nuts, birch sap, and orchards. So we're seeing an increase in the interest in doing that, but that's not really being reflected in Glastier. Apart from the fact that Glastier have now recently, or the Woodland Payments, has now actually introduced a means of funding agroforestry, which is quite interesting. You can now receive a payment which can be for capital works in agroforestry, which is quite interesting. We haven't found anybody who wants to that we surveyed anyway that was keen to go down this road. So I'll be interested to see how that develops and who applies for that and how that actually is reflected. But it's now something that it is being introduced, and it is something that hopefully we will see more of. So that's now one of the categories in Glastier. So that's kind of the end of what I was hoping to say. And apologies if this was a bit disjointed. I'm not actually given this specific presentation before. So it didn't quite flow as well as I was hoping. But thank you very much for listening. And diolch Efiona for organising everything.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Luke. A beth yw'r mefus ar yr bwrdd? Sut mae hwnna ffitio mewn? Beth yw'r mefus? What's the strawberry on the table? Your last slide.
So what was your question again, Efiona? Sorry?
The last slide had the strawberry. How does that tie into your work with the woodlands?
Do you want me to tie it up? Sorry, do you want me to?
No, the strawberry. Where did the strawberry that you showed on?
Oh, right. So the strawberries, those were part that. I suppose it was more just feeding into the local supply chains for soft fruits. That's from one of our separate projects with Mae'r. So that's our vertical farming or hydroponics project. So what those were they were strawberries we grew. That was grown in this January. It was a January crop, and the substrate for those strawberries was wool from the local farms. We're interested in using wool as a hydroponic substrate. And again, one of the problems with that and why that's not been done before is the waterproof characteristics of wool, which prevent them being used. They don't really hold water as well as necessary. But we reckon that there are a couple of ways in which we are looking at to actually develop a product that will open up that market for wool in the hydroponic sector, removing the lanolin from the wool, and then that will be a valuable co-product. And including sort of a plant-based hydrogel that would allow greater water retention. So the results we had have been really promising, and that will hopefully be another market for for rural Wales.
Yes. I did want to make a link to the work that you're doing in Mae'r on the vertical farming, which we're not covering this year, but probably there might be space next year for you to talk a bit more about that. So fi'n gwybod bod Luke yn gwneud gwaith ac yn arwain y prosiect tech tyfu ac maen nhw gwneud lot o waith i rolio allan salads er enghraifft, ac yr holl egwyddor o tyfu bwyd mewn ysgolion, ond hefyd gyda cwmnïau lleol yng Ngogledd Gorllewin Cymru. Felly diolch yn fawr iawn i Luke. Thank you, Luke, for your presentation. There was a question a while ago in the chat about squirrels. You said there was a mention of the project that you were working with people in Anglesey on for the red squirrels. There's a discussion, I think, was it a while ago in the chat about the trends in squirrels and how that causes problems for the nuts and that you're trying to establish some of those trees.
Yes, so the native squirrels in this country, in Wales, are red squirrels, as I think everyone probably knows. We have in sort of the last 50 years, these have been very much driven away by grey squirrels to the extent of almost extinction in most of the areas south of Scotland. Anglesey has been one of the last bastions where red squirrel populations have been saved, and this has been from some really good work by the Red Squirrel Trust and other organisations, which has been eradication of grey squirrels, which carry this a virus called the parapox virus that it actually kills off reds. Now, one of the reason that this is relevant is because grey squirrels have some quite destructive tendencies that red squirrels don't. So grey squirrels, for instance, will they will chew away at the apical meristems of trees. So they'll damage trees, sort of new growth. Red squirrels don't do that. Grey squirrels don't actually do that in North America. It's a bad habit that they've picked up in when they came to Britain. But that's very damaging economically for all forms of tree production. And grey squirrels will they'll eat acorns. Red squirrels don't eat acorns because there's so much there's too much tannin in there. So because of the volume of which grey squirrels consume acorns and other seeds, they actually prevent they're starting to sort of hugely prevent the rate at which native forests are regenerating, or oak forests anyway. So they cause a number of other problems, but with red squirrels, the overall effects are a much more positive one in the ecosystems, and as a result, grey squirrel removal is a really important economic priority for anybody dealing with trees at all. So we've been involved in red squirrel conservation work. We plant trees specifically for the purposes of providing food for red squirrels. So that includes hazel, that includes walnut, and that includes chestnut. One thing I didn't really talk about in the presentation that I would have liked to is that it's difficult to get species like chestnut through the grant system. Again, you might have slightly too low hectarage, or they might chestnut, for instance, isn't actually a native tree, or it's not considered native. So another option we've been looking at, and we have actually now done at Park Mae'r quite successfully, is we've attracted local businesses who wanted to appraise their carbon footprint and have wanted an alternative to carbon credits. And we've managed to convince them to subsidise these species of trees for the purposes of creating food for squirrels that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to obtain. So as a result of that investment from a local Anglesey business, we've been able to plant walnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts in the former Clearfell site. So that's been a really positive story that I haven't talked about it much because we've only just done it, and it's.
You're on mute, Daviana.
You're on mute.
With all the work that's going on in Menter Mon, I think we could keep you for a couple of days to talk about it, but we hope we'll get back to you next year and draw you in a bit more on the innovation work that you're doing with lots of different stakeholder groups across North Wales. Right, felly diolch yn fawr iawn am hynny. Thank you very much. Gallwn ni symud rwan, we'll move on now. If Vince is ready to unmute, Vince Mae'r a Sharon Mae'r hefyd o Tre Dafydd Organig sy'n lawr yn ardal Llŷn. Dwi'n nabod i gwaith nhw, eu cynnyrch nhw'n dda iawn, oherwydd bod nhw wedi bod yn rhedeg y farchnad y cynnyrch lleol Morthmadog hefyd, ac yn dod â'i cynnyrch yna i werthu, ac mae yna lot o glod iddyn nhw am y gwaith maen nhw wedi bod yn wneud yn y farchnad yn ogystal â dod ar cynnyrch gwych yma, a'r ffrwythau maen nhw'n ei ddefnyddio. a sut maen nhw'n ychwanegu gwerth at y ffrwythau yma i redeg busnes yn Llyn. Wedyn drosodd i chi, Vince, over to you, Vince.
Pnawn da i pawb, Vincent Mae'r dwi, ni'n byw yn ffrwythau yn Llyn yn Gwynedd. Dwi'n ddim yn siarad Cymraeg iawn, felly mi oedd y siarad i chi yn Saesneg. Okay, a little bit of background. I'm now 67, nearly 67 years old. I started gardening when I was 3. My grandfather had a small farm in Wiltshire where he kept hens and grew vegetables and barley. When I left school, I went to work for a farmer in Sussex, which is a mixed farm with fruit and veg, pigs, cattle, and very interestingly, we've just been doing some family research, and I discovered that I'd actually been working really just probably a few hundred yards from where my family had come from about the 1600s. I'm probably a person from the soil, and we found the same thing on the other side of the family in different Wiltshire and Dorset. So that's really my background. I used to, I went to the University at Bangor in the 1970s and a degree in agriculture and applied zoology, and then went into farming, briefly farm management, and got out of it partly due to ill health and also a disillusionment with intensive chemical farming. I then spent 20 odd years in gardening and landscaping, my own business, working for people with private gardens, local authorities, big companies, the government on MOD properties. So been around a bit, picked up a few gold medals for displays at garden shows, and back in 1989 I got it just across the road from here. With the intention of living here, I'd started an organic gardening catalogue off the back of my landscaping business, but then that all went down the tubes with the financial recession there. So in 2000, my wife and I got married, and we basically moved up here. I eventually ran down my business in the south of England in 2002-3, and was doing some landscaping up here. And then the opportunity came to buy Trwyddafydd, and in a fit of total madness, we decided we'd do that. So that's where the story starts. So I will just share the screen now. Except it doesn't seem to want to.
What are you trying to do?
There we go.
So you're going to click on here to make it full screen.
Can everybody see that?
Yes, lovely. Thank you. Great. Great. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. Right. So there's a photograph here of Sharon and myself and our son Hugh in 2010. That was 3 years after we'd started to turn the farm over to organic and started to try to grow fruit. We intended originally to grow strawberries and blueberries in the main and rotate them with some vegetables, and to sell into the hospitality market, hotels and restaurants and things. So this picture was taken actually at the start of the Portsmouth Local Project market of which we were founder members. And it was taken because we won the Gwynedd Taste and Talent Award for local produce. And you can see there are some little jars of jam. Well, that was our first attempts to do something different with the produce. And before we actually, that was not organic jam. We turned it over for organic jam later. So I'll just see if I can get onto the next slide, if I can. Sure. My wife told me how to do this. Hang on. There we go. There's an arrow. So why organic? As I already said, I became disillusioned with the intensive chemical form of agriculture and horticulture. I must have sprayed some of the most unpleasant chemicals there are. There was one called BR Destrol, which stood for British Rail Destroys All, which says everything. So I was already interested in organics. We wanted to be sustainable and wanted to look after the soil. I have suffered from a lot of different allergies, including food allergies. And so that was another thought that led us in that direction. And so we decided that we'd try and source all our fruit and obviously our seeds locally, not locally, organically. And we registered with the Soil Association and went through the process of conversion. I think I would like to mention at this point that we feel it's really important that people should go down the avenue of being certified, whether it's with an organic body or a biodynamic body, and not just say that they're growing organic, because nobody can actually tell whether that's really true, and it undermines the whole process. So I'll just move on to another slide. You'll see from here that we were selling on the local produce market, and we found that we had a lot of strawberries that were not fit to sell. We were growing them outdoors at the time, and we were trying to think of what we could do with these. It seemed a shame just to throw them on the compost heap or let them go rotten in the field. So we started making strawberry jam, and that was really where we moved from there. And the other problem, of course, with growing these sort of crops is actually how do you pick them? It's all very labour intensive, and one of the reasons there's not a very wide range of fruits that we can grow in this country on the market is because the things which are easy to do are strawberries and raspberries. They grow well in tunnels. They're not particularly prickly, relatively easy to pick. But if you go for other fruits like blackcurrants and gooseberries, they are a pain to pick. They take a lot of time. Gooseberries are extremely prickly, so that's why you don't see them. We quickly found that we couldn't manage to do all the work ourselves, so we started to have volunteers through Wrth and another organisation called Workaway, and mostly we had students. And the best of these have been the ones from France and Germany who study in specialist agricultural schools, and they come here as part of their training, really, and we actually give them some training, and we certify at the end of their time here what they've done and how well they've done it. You'll see from one of these pictures on the screen here that a picture of peaches. Because we make all our own compost, things start to come up in the soil in the polytunnel when we put the compost on, and I found this seedling once and I thought, that looks a bit like a peach or a plum, so I'll stick it in the ground somewhere, and it grew and it got bigger. And I thought, well, I'm pretty sure that's a peach. And I put it at the top end of the tunnel. The polytunnel is 20 feet wide and 12, 13 feet tall, probably more than that. And it now fills the whole end of the tunnel, and we get lots of peaches, which has led us to peach jam. And maybe Carolyn can tell us whether we're right in our naming of peaches, because we've had so many different suggestions as what it should be, and we've just plumped for one, and that's the way it goes. We can maybe talk to him about that later. We try and grow most of the things which we grow apart from the permanent soft fruits and top fruit from seed ourselves. It's all certified organic seed, and where I can, I save some of my own. We start those off in a little tiny polytunnel, a little tiny greenhouse, and we now have 2 polytunnels, which has made a huge difference to what we do. So let's find the next slide. Oh, that's our brand. We found that when we had the financial crash, our market for our fresh produce to hotels and restaurants very quickly dried up. The chefs still wanted it, but the owners decided it was too expensive. People were still coming here at that time, but the footfall was going down, and our market just disappeared, and they switched over to buying from wholesalers and buying groups. We thought, well, we've got to find a way of making this work. So decided to make our jams and chutneys and things fully organic, and the organisation which helps food businesses in Wales, called Chnau, very kindly found a graphic designer for us who designed our brand, which you'll see in the middle of the screen, which I believe is supposed to be me, but I'm not quite that hairy. But this has been the way in which we approached our marketing, to emphasize that the organic bit more than anything else. And our labeling is very plain, apart from the logo. But we try and make the organic big enough so that when you walk into the shop from several yards away, you can see our label saying organic on the shelf. And that's what we want to emphasize. As far as possible, we use as much as we can of our own produce, but there are things that we can't grow. Lemons, for example, oranges, which are ingredients in some of our products, and things like onions. Where we are here, we're 850 feet above sea level. There's nothing up between us and the United States, so the wind comes across here at 70 miles an hour. It's probably reached 50 here today. So we have to have things to stand up to the weather. Onions, if we have a good year, I can get a good crop. If I get a bad year, I don't get any. So it's a bit hit and miss, so we have to buy in from an organic wholesaler. We produce all our jams and chutneys and cordials in our own kitchen. It's all certified organic. So we have to be inspected every year by the Soil Association, not just for our growing, but also for our processing. And so that means usually we get away with one inspection, providing there's an inspector that can do both things. Otherwise, we may have to actually have 2 inspections. So the main things that go into the jams are strawberries, raspberries, black currants, gooseberries, red currants. We have chuckleberries as well, which is a new fruit which has been bred in Wales. down in the southern part by a company called Welsh Fruit Stocks, and that's a cross between, I think it's gooseberry, red currant, and I believe the black currant comes into it somewhere as well. And that's makes a jam which is redder and a bit more tart than a black currant jam, but it works very well. Otherwise, obviously we have the peaches, and we've just produced a new product called Peach Melba, which is a mixture of peaches and raspberries, and with a little bit of vanilla in it. And that seems to be quite popular as well. The chutneys are more difficult. We're always in two minds about them, because chutneys have always, and pickles have always been ways of preserving things, but often of using up produce which was gone past its best for all the surplus to needs. But they're actually a lot more difficult to produce. They've got more ingredients, it takes longer to make them. And for what we get back, probably not, as economical, but the customers want them, and this is why we produce them. And at the bottom of the screen here, we put get to know your suppliers, customers, and consumers, and that is extremely important, because you have to know your market and you have to have a good relationship.
Sorry, Vince, I'm going to have to cut in a moment, because to allow time for Simon to finish.
Okay, all right, we're not far off.
Okay, thank you. But okay, we only got 5 minutes left to the end of the session.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got a Great Taste Award in 2020 for our fiery rhubarb relish. Brexit has had a big problem, and COVID. It affected not only being able to get labour, but we actually had to, because most of our customers, retail customers, are local businesses which are not supermarkets. They ended up getting closed down initially, and so we had to, for 2020, start a veg delivery round, which worked quite well to begin with until the local wholesalers moved on it. But overall, what we realise, particularly as we're getting much older, is that we need to work smarter rather than harder. And just the last part here, climate change is a huge challenge, because we're in a marginal area which is very exposed in terms of weather events have a huge impact. We used to grow vegetables under fleece, but you can't now. The fleece gets blown away and everything underneath gets thrashed. We can't really grow strawberries outdoors anymore. You have to grow them in a tunnel. So it is a difficult relationship, and it's vitally important that everybody gets on top of the whole the climate problem. So I'll leave it there, and if anybody wants to ask any questions, then we'll wait for you to do so. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry, because I know people will have lots of questions to ask you. So they're going to put it in the chat, I'm hoping, and as that information is there, and you have a website that people can pick it up with, perhaps people can follow that up. So now we need to move very, very swiftly on to Simon, who will, obviously, as food waste is always left untalked about, we wish Simon all the best to squeeze it all in the time that we have left. Diolch, Simon. So if you can stop sharing, Vince, and then Simon can share his. Thank you.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah,
so I think what would be better is, rather than going through the slides, is just to give you a quick talk through some of the information on surplus fruit, just because it's quite lengthy. But if anybody wants my contact details, I can share those at the end. So Fair Share UK is part of a wider network of charities across the UK that form 21 different distribution centres, and we work with the private sector, public sector, to take in food that has, for whatever reason, become surplus, isn't commercially viable, but is still good to eat. So food becomes surplus for any number of reasons. These can include things like packaging or labeling errors, stock becoming surplus due to forecasting errors, stock below minimum life on receipt, fruit and veg that passed its best before end, but we've got manufacturer's extension letter, quality rejections, bulk ingredients, seasonal stock, or a wealth of other reasons. And in the last year, Fèche Cymru alone, so just the Wales division of Fèche, we've diverted some 116,000 kilograms of fruit away from going to waste, and we've diverted it to vulnerable people in Wales through our network. So this obviously helps to tackle hunger for a large number of people by allowing them access to nutritious food, but it isn't nearly enough to tackle both waste levels and hunger when almost a quarter of the Welsh population lives in poverty. So I wanted to give a quick summary of some firms that we work with to help them tackle their own surplus fruit challenges. So one would be Fruitful Office, who are a basket fruit delivery company. And they've got a long history of working with us since they were just a 3-year-old company back in 2009. So as part of their strict quality processing checks, for whatever reason, the customers they deliver to want the fruit to be physically appealing. So it looks pretty, a banana looks like a banana, etc., etc. So any that don't meet that rigorous process can be diverted to Fèche, where it's still good, nutritious food, and we can divert it to them. So they provide us with over 2 tons of fruit per week, which is the equivalent of over 4,500 meals. And we also work with AMT Fruit, who are part of the Munoz group, who are the sole supplier of citrus fruit to Tesco. And they've been diverting fruit to us, over 17 tons of citrus fruit, which has helped them towards this sustainable development goals, which include halving their per capita waste and reduce losses along the production and the supply chain. So that includes post-harvest losses. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the environmental impact of food waste, with a specific focus on fruit. So we recently published a study in collaboration with the Carbon Trust, which some of you may have seen if it's hot on your reading list, which was published back in September, and I can share any links, Aviona, if you'd like for me to share those out. And it found that if food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of carbon globally after China and the USA. So with reducing the impact of climate change on the front of mind for most of the public discourse, we were really disappointed that COP26 didn't really look at the issue of food waste, which we thought was a very wasted opportunity when, you know, the mind was focused. And this is in spite of the fact that food waste alone accounts for between 6 and 7% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions. And so for each ton of food that is reallocated through a firm like Fèche, rather than simply being wasted, for each ton reallocated, 1.6 tons of embedded carbon dioxide is saved. So this hidden carbon can arise from the energy used in everything from cultivation to harvesting, packaging and transportation. And our study states that from the 6,699 tons of food waste that Fèche nationally, so rather than just at a Wales level, nationally diverts, a carbon saving of 10,698 tons of CO2 has been made. And of this figure, fruit makes up 5% of the total amount of food waste that's been tackled there. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on was a fund that Fèche Cymru has recently had from Welsh Government, from the Waste Department, specifically looking to level the playing field, because for the most part, our relationship is with larger producers just because of the volumes that they deal with. But what we've got is a fund called the Surplus with Purpose Cymru Fund. And what that does is it allows us to offset any losses experienced by firms in diverting surplus edible food to Fèche. And it allows that company to reduce their waste and increase the level of social good that their food waste is doing. So we recognize that you know, the costs can be incurred from diverting away from things like sending surplus food to animal waste, or to produce animal feed, sending it to anaerobic digestion. And often it's the costs involved with harvesting fruit or vegetables that are still in the fields. So a good recent example, if you've driven past the field, would be pumpkins that have just been left in the field rather than being picked and harvested because the costs were too much for the demand that was there. So what the Surplus with Purpose Cymru Fund does is it offsets any costs in getting involved in getting the food from its place on the farm to us for redistribution. So it's open to all Welsh businesses that might need the cost of harvesting being kept, packaging, for storage, the cost of transporting it. And we've worked with some national food brands who've done things like set up separate production lines. So previously they'd put frozen carrots, for example, into big bulk packaging, which is too large for storage. But what the fund allowed them to do was set up a separate production line just to make distributable packs to fair share. We've also worked with brands like Costa Coffee, who'd produced trial lines of tins of coffee that hadn't got labels on them because they were in product development. But what the fund allowed them to do was produce labels for those, had all the nutritional information, storage information, end of life dates, and then that could be redistributed to people vulnerable people across Wales rather than just being sent to landfill. But as the session looks specifically at fruit, I wanted to give some more pertinent examples. So using our funds, we were able to divert over 30 tons of berries to fair share. So these were diverted to groups, but because the volumes were so large, they couldn't be sent from farm to us for processing and then redistributing out to the vulnerable group. So what we did was for some of them, we pressed them down into long life juice. So the fund was available that we used it to convert the berries into long life juice, which could then be stored for longer and distributed in 2 different size packs, one for family sizes, one for individual consumption. And we were able to offset that cost using a third-party supplier to process the juice, mix it with apple juice and make that. And the other thing we were able to do was cover the cost of putting the berries, to freeze down the berries, and then they could be put in 2 cook freezer packs, which we could then distribute to families and to groups across our network of vulnerable people. So I'm sorry if that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through. I was hoping that I'd get you all onto your coffee break because I realized that the time is late in the day. So if you or an organisation would be interested in discussing how you could use the fund, I've put the link to Fair Share Cymru and the Surplus with Purpose Fund previously on Padlet. So please feel free to contact me through there. But I'll also make sure that Avion has got my details. If you know a business in your network that has any issues with surplus food, please put them in touch because it would be great not only to receive a donation from them, but if it's something that would be a cost to them to donate the food to Fair Share Cymru, we do have a fund available that could offset those costs there. And I want to apologise, we are having our 10th anniversary party today. I'm not normally so on brand when I call it from Fair Share. But thank you very much for your time, and sorry for the very quick presentation there.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that you've been squeezed at the end of the session. I look forward to hearing from you when you come and speak to our students at Bangor a bit more length. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Felly, i ddod â hwn i ben, hoffwn ni ddiolch i'r siaradwyr i gyd, i Carwyn, i Luke, i Vince, ag i Simon Stranks yn fan hyn efo ni am ei amser prawn 'ma. A diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd.